So I feel like the Trump administration is finally figuring out that aligning yourself with Benjamin Netanyahu, while there's definitely some overlap in interests, and I don't think any of this is personal, but when you form an unbreakable alliance with any foreign country, you're likely to get hurt.
So recently, Tucker Carlson revealed the dark truth about U.S. foreign policy, why it remains virtually the same regardless of supposedly different presidential administrations that come one after another, and what are the ramifications of this for America. This is in the conversation with Auron MacIntyre, so let's get their viewpoints on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
And American interests are likely to get hurt, and I think it's dawning on them that, if another country, I don't know, decides to move 2 million people by force in the biggest internment mass migration since the Second World War, you don't want to have to take credit for that. Are you surprised?
Not really. Obviously, this is a terrible situation in the Middle East, and you can sit around and say, Israel should have been formed one way, Palestine should look another.
Right, exactly.
But the truth is, at the end of the day, these two peoples are completely incompatible, and one of them is going to try to remove the other. That's a really ugly thing. Nobody should ultimately think that's positive. But if you look throughout history, the solution most nations have to this issue is ethnic cleansing. That's just what happens throughout history. Again, you don't have to judge it one way or another. You just have to look at history and know that's how these things tend to get resolved. And it's ugly business for anyone. And why should we involve ourselves on either side of that, right? I just don't understand how that would ever serve America.
That's exactly right. Of course this is going to happen. And it's dawned on me slowly. It's like, wait, but what about the 2 million or however many are still alive, people like Palestinians in Gaza? Like, what? Well, we'll just move them somewhere else. What? No one's tried that in 80 years. It didn't work then. Now everyone has an iPhone. It's going to be on video. It's totally immoral and disgusting. But it's also, as you just pointed out, inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, they've tried to, move them into Egypt. Egypt doesn't want to take them. But the problem really is Israeli force, the imposition of murderous force upon Gazans. And this is just one example of why entangling alliances are so horrific for the United States, that we just inherit all of Israel's enemies by supporting Israel no matter what. The Israel first mentality, continuing to back Netanyahu, an obvious war criminal, and that might be putting it lightly, by siding with these monsters. And, the Gazans are being starved. They've reduced 400 aid stations to 4, 2 of which are open on any given day for about 15 minutes, and they throw out the food for about 15 minutes. People stampede. They fire live rounds above their heads, according to whistleblower Anthony Aguilar, and they don't distribute water. So that's what we're getting out of Gaza as Netanyahu prepares to occupy it.
Again, it's messy, but it's a historical reality. And if we deny that, then we're going to end up getting caught in this never-ending cycle. The only reason this really hasn't happened, again, one direction or the other, it's not that I think the Palestinians probably wouldn't have a similar solution if they were in the Israelis' shoes. But the only reason this hasn't happened is there has kind of been this international consensus to involve ourselves in what otherwise would be a natural process throughout history. And so that's why we find ourselves stuck here over and over again. This is never going to get solved through diplomacy. You're never going to work out the ways in which you find it. No, it's going to end with one group displacing the other. That's just going to happen. And it's just...
Yeah, and Israel feels emboldened to do so on the bankroll of the United States. If the United States didn't intervene, I don't think they'd bomb 4 or 5 of their neighbors and committed genocide in Gaza, if not that was the case. And they've struck against Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and Iran and Gaza since then. And it's all excuses for the Greater Israel Project. They have to claim that, there's some existential crisis that's always trying to wipe them off the map, despite the fact that that clearly isn't happening. On the contrary, Israel's expanding not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank settlements, parts of Syria and Lebanon, while they commit these atrocities.
Not our problems. There's no reason we should have our money, our treasure, our people, or more importantly, our moral worth tied up to any of this.
But that's kind of the American way, isn't it? I mean, historically, and you've taught history, that the United States forms unbreakable alliances with countries that share its values. That's what we're told. Is that true?
No, and that's the most hilarious thing is like over and over again, we hear this, oh, don't you care about America? Don't you care about American values? Actually, if we look at what the founders said about foreign policy, it's radically different. George Washington, in his farewell address, was very clear about the way we should approach foreign alliances. He said, basically, you shouldn't have them. You can have commercial relationships. You should trade with other nations, be friendly as possible. But he says very explicitly, never, ever have a favored nation or a nation that you hate, because either way, it makes you a slave to that nation. And a free nation should be free of foreign influence. He very clearly says that foreign influence is the death of any given republic. And so he says, be very careful about making some nation your favorite nation, because the natural dynamic that will happen, and I promise I'm not making any of this up. I'm not like, tailoring this in some way to the current environment.
So this should be clear.
Yeah, how prophetic is that? He's exactly right. And it wasn't just Washington. If you look at, for instance, Jefferson's first inaugural address, he says essentially what he believes to be the cornerstone principles of America in regard to foreign policy is peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. And this was a near universal view among the founders, including those that battled against each other regarding, say, the ratification of the Constitution. And later you had people like John Quincy Adams, a guy I don't particularly think was a great president. I do think he was a great diplomat, though, saying when boasting about the best merits of America, he said, Americans go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And that's the mentality that characterized the early American Republic, and that is, one of its most redeeming features, if you ask me. So Auron's completely right about this. I really recommend people take a look at Washington's farewell address and Jefferson's first inaugural address in particular on this.
This is Washington's farewell address.
Right.
Which is, quote, there's one line from it, don't make foreign alliances or something that is, everyone's kind of familiar with. But he goes on about it?
Oh, for several pages. And he explains exactly the dynamic that's going to happen. He says, you're going to associate this favored nation with your own nation. You're going to conflate its interests with its own interests. And not only will that happen, the different leaders of political factions inside your nation will start vying for favorability with the favored nation, showing themselves to be the true ally while you're the one who is deceiving everyone and you are actually betraying our true ally. And he says,
that's exactly how it's panned out in America. If you're not with Israel first, you're an anti-Semite. How many times do we hear this over and over? If you're not for, giving $200 billion or more to Zelensky, you're obviously a pro-Putin agent. We hear this time and time again. It's part of the propaganda machine, and Washington prophesied it correctly.
It's even going to get worse, because the real patriots that point out that you are favoring that nation instead of the interests of the real country you live in, those people will be now denounced as traitors. And
no way.
Yes, it says very clearly. And so he's warned us about everything that we...
Washington wrote that?
Yeah, 100%.
Washington said the people who stand up and say, wait a second, nothing against that other country, but our country's interests should be the main focus of the U.S. government. That guy will be denounced as like a tool of Qatar.
Right. And this is a document. This is a document.
Yeah, figuratively speaking, I mean, you insert X's and Y's into the equation, but that is how it happened. And this was actually controversial during Washington's administration because he issued what's called the neutrality proclamation, a kind of executive edict that said that the United States would remain neutral in the wars between France and Britain at the time. Actually, the French Revolutionary Wars, it spilled into wars with Austria and other powers eventually, of course. And it was controversial because the United States had signed two separate alliances with France in 1778 that said that it would assist France as an ally financially if it came time to. When France wanted to collect on that, Washington was having nothing of it. The Republicans did want to fund this and retorted that, hey, Congress has the ability to set foreign policy aims in regard to actually funding, and that's where the House has the purse of the Republic. And this was a kerfuffle, but I think the policy prognosis was right. Neutrality was a good thing, and it kept the United States out of bankruptcy, at least for a long time. We weren't embroiled in European affairs for a long time. There are some exceptions, but that was a good policy.
that every school child used to have to learn. This is what in every history class you would go, this is one of our core documents along with the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address. But we never go over this anymore, and I don't think that's any kind of strange coincidence. It very clearly contradicts everything about our current foreign policy, and that's what the founders actually believed.
That's so prescient, it's almost spooky.
It is. That's exactly right. But that is what the documented proof shows. And again, this ran the gamut of America's political class back in the founding era. They didn't squabble over which countries to attack overseas in regard to warfare. They squabbled over internal improvements and tariffs and a central bank and things like that. It was nothing to do with this absurd empire building foreign policy that wasn't even on people's conceptions at the time. Rightly so.
It's absolutely amazing when you go back and read the words. You would think he's speaking exactly to the situation we're in now. And of course, you can see this with many places. You can see this with Israel, but you can also see it with Ukraine.
Oh, for sure.
And it's so strange that the right learned this lesson with Ukraine, right? We all learned that actually this deep state will send us to war, and they don't care about the boys in Appalachia or Texas. And it's not about defending America. We all recognize that when the Biden administration was calling us, Putin puppets because we didn't want to send blood and treasure to Ukraine. But all of a sudden, we have a similar situation where we might need to involve ourselves, and we forget all of the lessons we learned. We forget all of the foreign policy that we were actually supposed to be following if we're following the American tradition.
Man, I think that's the best point. There are so many people on the right that are so good when it comes to the right mentality, the right instincts regarding Ukraine is to get out of there, disengage. That embroiled, entangling alliance against a nuclear power is a bad thing. But then don't apply those same lessons to Israel, probably the most destructive entangling alliance that the U.S. has been involved in for something like 6 or 7 decades. That is the problem, and vice versa, too. I'm not just putting this on the right. A lot of forces on the left or the liberal establishment have problems with aid to Israel and then don't apply those great and prescient lessons to Ukraine. So the same phenomenon remains, and he's totally right.
That's amazing. When did that fall out of the curriculum, do you think?
It's a great question. I have never had it as something when I was a history teacher that was required reading. I went through it because I thought it was something important for students to understand. But as a necessary part or mandatory part of the curriculum, it was never there. Maybe a short excerpt. I mean, it's only a 30-page thing, but we're not allowed to have students actually look at any kind of primary sources anymore, because one of the nasty things that happens when you look at old books that were written before, say, 1945, is you determine that the world is actually very different and that there's something very radical and modern that's happened. That's why we don't read primary sources, because then we might actually know some history.
That is so true, and it's part of the curriculum regime we have. I mean, I went through government schools, and my experience is learning about America as a unique, exceptional force that should be the world's policeman, and it's always intervened on the side of good against evil. They reduce it to caricatures and say that this is a shining city on the hill, and we have to export that shining city on the hill to other places. This is the neocon experiment, the death and destruction of what is truly sensible and in accordance with the original America First principles.
Anything written pre-Second World War has a completely different tone that you can feel, even if they're not saying, even if the document itself doesn't say anything that is particularly radical to the modern sensibility. The way that it's written, the sort of freedom of expression, you realize how much censorship and self-censorship exists post-war when you read it. I mean, it's like, read a Lothrop Stoddard book, for example. It's amazing that people wrote stuff like that.
It's also the amount of historical context. Everyone knew the language of the old world. They understood that they were connected to a chain of tradition, and everything that they spoke about was deeply seated in that context. If you go back and read Hobbes's Leviathan, even though he's making an argument for secular government, 9/10 of it is couched in biblical language. It's nothing but biblical references, and he makes casual references to very complex theological issues that he assumes everyone is familiar with. And this is the exact same thing you see with the founders, whether it be in the Federalist Papers or Washington's Farewell Address. These are men who are deeply built into a very specific tradition and understand everything about the world inside of that. And we just don't see that anymore. Now, when we look at history, it's all these little blocks of carefully managed narrative. It has no connection to the actual lives lived by our ancestors.
That's so true. The founding class pointed back to history as evidence for what was to come and the lessons to learn and the catastrophes to avoid based on those historical lessons. This is something that we don't get today. I think Alexander Hamilton, who I'm no fan of, actually pointed to this at one point and said that history is the lamp which guides my feet. It was either him or Henry. I can't believe I'm forgetting this. No. Hamilton said history is the oracle of truth. And Patrick Henry said that I only know of one thing, and it's the lamp of truth, and we only know what's to come in the future but by observing the past. I'm paraphrasing there. But both of those men, on different sides of ratification in those two cases, had the same view on this. Now, it was a lot limited to the aristocracy, the well-educated class, and people like Thomas Paine brought these ideas to the layman, to the mainstream, through Common Sense and other writings, using what was called vulgarity, a language that was conducive to those people too. So the commoners were hearing this message too. And this phenomenon, even in the age where all the information of the world is essentially at our fingertips, is lost to some extent, and it is because of cultural rot.
Well, I don't think we have ancestors as a nation, right? I mean, what percentage of the population has an ancestor who fought in the Civil War?
Yeah, they're increasingly very few. And that's actually a huge problem as we face these issues coming with deportations. A lot of people are asking, okay, we understand mass deportations for illegals. We get that. But what about legal immigrants? How does that work? Who is an American ultimately, right? And that's really going to be the question of our age. We're transitioning from a moment where identity globally was very ideological, right? You're either communist or you're capitalist. You're with one empire or another. You're first world or second world. That was shattered, right? That paradigm was shattered after the end of the Cold War. And instead, we all had to turn back inward and stop having this global ideological struggle and ask, okay, now that that's gone, who are we as peoples again? And that struggle to understand national identity, I think, is seeping through everything, including our ability to understand our own traditions and understand how our Constitution work and what our values actually are, not just what's being handed to us by the news media or an educational system.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly agree with this. I think local identities are far more important than national identities, and the U.S. Constitution was intended to be a league of states, not the formation of a new nation state in the traditional sense. It was a compact among states delegating to a general government a certain subset of powers. Those are listed in Article 1, Section 8. So, but even people like Jefferson, who was a Francophile, acknowledged that, he had one writing one time when he said, if France vomited forth thousands of Frenchmen onto the United States shores, there's no doubt that that would change society. So these are issues that we have to grapple with. That would change even potential values that a society has, its priorities, its foreign policy, its sensibilities regarding domestic policy. That's unavoidable, and you can't change that regardless of how you set up your immigration policy. If you let a lot of people in with different sensibilities, they're not going to necessarily blend in. And that's been the case in America for a long time, for better or worse. I think the best solution is decentralization, cloistering, a national divorce of sorts that disposes of this centralizing government mentality where everything has to be controlled by Washington, D.C.
So we're understanding ourselves in a very different way. And where does that shake out? Like, what is identity post ideology?
Well, the most traditional understanding of identity is a collection of many different factors, including language, religion, people, place, heritage, tradition, folkways, history. These things were all the different aspects that made up human society until we needed to create these supranational organizations run by managerial elites that didn't have any connection to these individual places. And that's why we see over and over again our different world governments desperately trying to erode the particular nature of peoples. If you look at the UK right now, they're completely destroying any free speech tradition. They're completely destroying any Anglo understanding of rights, and they're all doing it in the name of creating this multicultural society that England never had in the first place. And so you see these elites who are destroying the nature and quality of their people. They're actively replacing the people in their nation, because if they do that, then those barriers to the power that previously existed that were tied to the tradition will be gone.
Yeah, there's no doubt that's true. When it comes to UK, it's hard to disagree with him. We've seen the same propensity in the United States too, where the elites among the society are deliberately engaging in behaviors that are conducive more to globalists and not to localism, not to communities first, but to, interests throughout the World Bank, the WEF, getting involved in entangling alliances on behalf of the military-industrial complex, which the average American couldn't give a damn about. But that's where we're at now. A mass immigration regime, which is its own government program to some extent, to have an immigration regime where it's even possible for about 30 to 40 million illegal immigrants to come across the borders. And you're going to say that won't change these traditions, that won't change the American heritage and some of the best American principles like the entrepreneurial spirit and a sensible non-interventionist foreign policy come to an end. I think that it's guaranteed that some of those things will shift. I think ultimately the answer isn't, a centralized crackdown on immigration, if that's your biggest concern. I think it's decentralization. And I have every reason to believe that if we truly had decentralization, states like Texas would be able to have stricter immigration controls than, say, California, if California didn't want them, which they don't, rather than just deferring all that power to Washington, D.C. to make a one-size-fits-all solution that none of those states, regardless on which polarized side they're on that question, are pleased with. And the states could, discriminate who comes into their state on the basis of that too. That's how they handled it up until 1875. There was the Privilege and Immunities Clause of the Constitution where American citizens that were citizens of the states could move between states, but states could, expel foreigners if they didn't meet the criteria that state wanted. But instead, we just kick that power out to Washington, D.C. But our foreign policy is so flawed. I'm glad they talked about that too. But it is violating the best lessons of the founders that have brought us to this point, to the point where the United States government, regardless of who happens to sit in the presidential throne at that time, is beholden to the Israel lobby, is beholden to Israel, the Israel first mentality, getting into regime change wars on behalf of Israel. And don't get me wrong, people within the United States are complicit too. The neocons are horrific monsters, and they get involved in regime change experiments on behalf of these regimes overseas in the Middle East as part of the clean break strategy for Israel to, instead of seeking peace, to create war with their neighbors and consummate a genocide in Gaza. And I don't think there's going to be an end to it until the Israel lobby's power is curtailed. We're seeing a change among the sensibilities of people regarding Israel, even on the right now, where younger conservatives are having more of an issue with this boomer America first principle. Not all boomers think that, but it is older conservatives by and large that support that. Thankfully, most of the left really opposes what's happening, and much of the left has opposed it from the jump, and I appreciate that too. But it's this empire building scheme that violated the best American principles, if you ask me. And they've been able to propagandize people into truly believing that America is the world's policeman, especially since World War II. And it used to be the traditional conservative narrative that World War II was basically the worst thing ever. It should have been averted. It could have been averted many times with less loss of life. And the United States got involved in entangling alliances before Pearl Harbor through Lend-Lease and through the destructive capacity to, support one side of the Hitler versus Stalin battle and, to allow Stalin to take half of Europe. It was the most catastrophic event in world history, essentially, in terms of losses of life. It was a bad thing. Dropping the nuclear bombs were not only immoral, but unnecessary, because Japan was prepared to surrender with some basic terms like legal protections for the emperor. As soon as May of 1945, those things were ignored to set the Cold War policy, to show America had this power, this ungodly power that had never been seen before. And that's what we get. Our foreign policy is a product of that myth. America's civil religion that believes that everything conducive to interventionism is right. You always point back to World War II as the example for that. For those that disagree, they're always a Chamberlain, even though Chamberlain was the one that declared war against Germany. And they never cite the bad examples that have happened more closely to our lifetimes and in more applicable theaters like, hey, Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya. All these catastrophic regime change failures that didn't pay dividends. But that's where we're at. I do want to hear from you guys, though. Let me know down below. Is Auron MacIntyre and Tucker Carlson right? Is America's foreign policy foolhardy? Have the founders' best opinions been betrayed by this foreign policy? Let me know down below. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to Tucker also. Please consider becoming a YouTube member if you click the join button below. You can become a member, support the channel, and in return, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.